She walked past me on a subway platform in Osaka at 7:40 in the morning, and I remember thinking, that's not possible. Not after a night shift, not after rush hour, not after whatever life had already asked of her before the sun came up. Her eyes weren't tired. Her skin wasn't tired. Even the way she held her bag wasn't tired. And I stood there for a second, forgetting to walk, because something in me quietly asked, wait, what does she know that I don't? I assumed it was genetics. That's the easy answer, the one that lets you off the hook. But genetics doesn't explain why her mother, 61 years old, looked the same way at a family gathering I was invited to months later. 3 generations, same face. Not the same bone structure. The same absence of something the rest of us carry without noticing. So I started asking. Quietly, awkwardly, the way you ask a question you're embarrassed to admit you care about. And the answers I got weren't what I expected. No serum, no miracle cream, no secret ingredient flown in from somewhere expensive. Something smaller than that. Something almost too small to believe. Here's the first one, and it starts somewhere strange. It starts with a 500-year-old massage that most people have never heard of. Picture the Imperial Court of Japan in the late 1400s. 2 rival massage masters, each convinced the other's technique was inferior, entered into a competition to prove whose method could preserve youth more completely. Neither one won outright. Instead, their combined technique became something new, something reserved afterward for empresses and noble women only, passed down in near secrecy for centuries. It's called Kobido, ancient way of beauty. Here's what makes it strange. It isn't really a beauty treatment. It's closer to acupressure wearing a disguise. The practitioner's fingers move along specific points on the face called tsubo, the same points used in traditional meridian therapy, pressing and releasing in patterns that follow invisible lines of energy running just beneath the skin. Lymphatic drainage happens almost as a side effect. The real target is tension sitting in muscles you didn't know you were clenching. I found this out from a woman named Yuki, a friend of a friend, who mentioned it almost dismissively over coffee. The way you'd mention something so ordinary to you that it never occurred to you it might be interesting to someone else. Her grandmother had learned a simplified version from a neighbor decades ago. 5 minutes each morning. Nothing formal, no certification, just fingers pressing lightly along the cheekbones and temples in a pattern she'd repeated so many times it had become as automatic as brushing her teeth. Yuki did it now too. Not because she believed in energy meridians exactly, because it worked, and she'd stopped questioning why. So why does this matter for someone who will never book a 60-minute Kobido session in her life? Because the insight underneath it does something bigger than any single treatment. It reveals that puffiness, dullness, that flattened, tired look on a face often has almost nothing to do with sleep. It has to do with fluid that's stopped moving and pressure that's never released. A face can be exhausted the same way a room can be exhausted. Air gone stale, nothing circulating. Everything sitting exactly where it landed hours ago. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If tiredness isn't really about rest, what is it actually about? That question sat with me longer than I expected. Because once you start looking for stagnation instead of exhaustion, you start seeing it everywhere. In the way people hold their shoulders, in the way they breathe through their mouths without noticing, in the way an entire face can go quiet and stiff by 3 p.m. without a single dramatic event causing it. And that's when the second secret revealed itself. And it wasn't a technique at all. It was something closer to a discipline of noticing. There's a phrase that shows up in traditional Japanese wellness thinking, something closer to a principle than an instruction. The face keeps a record of every unexpressed tension, not metaphorically, literally. Every time you clench your jaw during a stressful call and never release it. Every time your brow tightens reading a message you didn't want to read and stays tightened for the next 4 hours because nobody reminded you to let go. Most people carry this tension permanently at such a low level they've stopped registering it as tension at all. It simply feels like their face. But the muscles around the eyes, the jaw, the forehead, they don't reset automatically. They wait for a signal, a conscious unclenching, and if that signal never comes, the tension becomes structural. It shows up eventually as tiredness that no amount of sleep can undo because sleep was never the problem. So here's where the story actually pivots earlier than you might expect, because once this idea lands, it changes what the entire video is actually about. This was never a story about tiredness. It's a story about attention, about a very specific kind of attention almost nobody practices anymore. The habit of noticing your own body's small signals throughout the day instead of only reacting once they've become impossible to ignore. Think about how differently most of us actually live. We treat our faces like something that simply happens to us, a fixed weather system we have no influence over, when in reality, it's closer to a live recording of every unaddressed moment of stress we've had since we woke up. The women who never look tired aren't gifted with different faces. They're gifted with a different relationship to their own signals. Which brings us to the third secret, and this one starts in water. There's a specific bathing culture in Japan built around alternating temperature, most visible in outdoor hot spring baths called Rotenburo, where bathers move deliberately between the heat of the mineral water and the cold shock of open winter air, sometimes stepping briefly into snow before returning to the steam. It sounds almost masochistic until you understand the mechanism. Heat expands blood vessels near the surface, cold contracts them. That alternation, repeated, functions like a pump for circulation, flushing stagnant fluid and waking up vessels that had gone sluggish and lazy from sitting still. This same principle gets applied on a smaller scale at home, in something as simple as washing the face first with warm water, then finishing with cool. Most people rinse with whatever temperature comes out of the tap first and never think about it again. But that small contrast, warm then cool, repeated daily, mimics the exact circulatory effect of the hot spring ritual in miniature. Puffiness drains, dullness lifts, not because of any product, because something that had gone still finally started moving again. There's a specific moment worth picturing here because it explains the mechanism better than any diagram could. Imagine standing waist deep in steaming mineral water, snow falling somewhere just beyond the wooden fence, your shoulders finally loosening after the first few minutes of heat. Then you step out deliberately into air cold enough to sting, just for a few seconds before returning to the warmth. It sounds like discomfort for no reason, but something happens in that brief cold exposure. The vessels near the skin's surface tighten sharply, then release again the moment you're back in the heat. And that tightening, releasing motion is exactly what a sluggish, stagnant circulatory system needs to remember how to move. Most people never do anything remotely like this, and most people don't need the full ritual to benefit from the principle behind it. Even the small version, warm water first, then a deliberate few seconds of cool at the very end of washing, produces a miniature version of the same pump. It isn't about temperature for its own sake. It's about giving the body a reason to move fluid that would otherwise sit exactly where it landed since the last time it moved at all. Notice the pattern forming here. Kobido works by releasing what's stuck. Contrast bathing works by moving what's stagnant. Neither one is really about tiredness at all. Both are about circulation, in every sense of that word, physical and otherwise. Which means the real invisible force running through this entire story isn't exhaustion. It's stillness. Things inside the body that have simply stopped moving, unnoticed, for far too long. Stillness doesn't announce itself. That's what makes it dangerous. Nobody feels their circulation slow down the way they feel a headache arrive. It happens in silence, in the 10,000 small moments of sitting too long, breathing too shallow, holding a posture the body never asked to hold. You don't notice stillness accumulating any more than you'd notice dust settling in a room you never bothered to walk through, and then one day, you catch your reflection in a window and don't recognize the tiredness staring back because you never saw it arrive. It didn't arrive. It accumulated. So what happens to a body that never gets that signal to move again? That's the fourth secret, and it lives somewhere you wouldn't expect to find beauty advice. It lives in the spine. There's an old cultural emphasis, rooted partly in traditional Seiza sitting posture, on carrying the body as though a thread runs gently upward from the crown of the head, lifting the spine without stiffening it. You've seen the opposite without realizing what you were looking at, shoulders curling forward, the head jutting slightly ahead of the spine. An entire posture that seems to be quietly apologizing for taking up space. That collapsed posture isn't just aesthetic, it's respiratory. A compressed chest cavity means shallower breathing, thousands of times a day, which means less oxygen reaching the blood with every single breath. That reduction is so gradual, nobody notices it happening in real time, but it compounds, breath after breath, into exactly the flat, drained look this whole story keeps circling back to. And there's something almost philosophical hiding inside this detail. The way someone holds their spine often mirrors the way they're holding their life. Tension collapses posture. A sense of ease lifts it. So when someone corrects their spine gently throughout the day, they're not adjusting bones. They're quietly rehearsing an entirely different relationship with their own presence in a room. Here's a moment worth sitting inside for a second. A woman standing at a bus stop in the rain, no umbrella, bag held close to her chest. Anyone else in that position might tighten instinctively, shoulders creeping toward the ears, jaw locking against the cold. She didn't. She stood there loose, present, like the rain was simply weather, not an inconvenience aimed at her personally. That's the same skill running under everything so far. Not resistance. Release. The difference between fighting a moment and simply standing inside it. Which brings us to the fifth secret, the quietest one, and in some ways, the one that explains all the others. There's a concept from a Japanese psychiatrist named Morita, developed in the early 1900s, called arugamama. It roughly translates to accepting things exactly as they are without immediately trying to fix, judge, or fight them. It was originally developed as therapy for anxiety, but the principle bleeds into something much smaller and more personal. The way someone looks at her own reflection in a mirror. Most people, glancing at themselves, run a silent inventory of flaws automatically. The under-eye shadow, the blemish, the line that wasn't there last year. It happens so fast it doesn't even register as a choice. It just feels like looking. But there's another way to look, one closer to arugamama, where the mirror simply shows a face as it is today, without an investigation launched against it. Not indifference, just the absence of a silent argument. Here's why this matters more than it sounds like it should. Chronic self-criticism produces chronic stress hormones. Chronic stress hormones produce chronic muscular tension. And chronic tension produces exactly the tired, tight, drained appearance this whole story has been circling from the very first sentence. The face doesn't only reflect how rested someone is, it reflects how kindly they've been treating themselves silently for years, every single time they've looked in a mirror. So here's the moment everything converges. Kobido releases what's stuck in the muscles. Contrast bathing moves what's gone stagnant in circulation. A lifted spine restores oxygen the body was quietly starving itself of. And arugamama interrupts the one habit capable of undoing all three. The quiet, constant self-criticism that manufactures new tension faster than any ritual could release it. None of these 5 things were ever separate tricks. They were 5 entry points into the exact same discipline, staying in relationship with your own body instead of ignoring its signals until they become loud enough to be impossible to miss. Prevention instead of correction. Attention instead of neglect. And that's why none of this photographs well, why nobody films themselves gently unclenching their jaw at a desk, or standing a little straighter while waiting for a kettle to boil, or looking in a mirror and simply choosing not to argue with what they see. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like an achievement, but multiplied across a single year, then across a decade, it becomes the entire difference between a face that shows every unresolved moment of stress it's ever carried and one that quietly let each of those moments go the day they arrived. So let's go back to where this started, that woman on the platform in Osaka. I assumed she had a secret locked away somewhere I didn't have access to. Genetics, culture, something unreachable. But she didn't have a secret. She had a habit of noticing tension the moment it arrived instead of carrying it for 6 more hours. A habit of letting her circulation move instead of stagnate. A habit of walking like her spine mattered. A habit of looking at her own face the way you'd look at a friend, not a problem waiting to be solved. None of that requires being Japanese. None of it requires a certain city or income or bone structure. It requires attention paid consistently, kindly, to a body that has been quietly asking for it the whole time, in the background of every single day you've been too busy to notice. I think about Yuki sometimes, and her grandmother, and the 5 minutes she spent every morning without ever calling it a ritual, without ever framing it as self-care or wellness, or any of the words we'd reach for now. To her, it was just Tuesday. Just something you did with your hands while the kettle boiled, the same way you might hum a tune you don't remember learning. That's the part that's easy to miss in all of this. None of it needed to be impressive to work. It only needed to be repeated. So maybe the real question was never why she didn't look tired. Maybe it's what your own face has been asking of you for years that you simply haven't heard yet. And maybe hearing it right now is where it finally begins.